In the spring of 2011, a 104-year-old woman lay in a hospital bed on the 14th floor of Beit Israel Medical Center in New York City. She had been there for 20 years, not because she was dying, not yet, but because she chose it. Outside, three of the most spectacular properties in America sat empty, their rooms frozen in time, their pianos unplayed, their gardens untouched. She owned all of them. She visited none of them. And while she lay there, in voluntary isolation, the people she trusted most were quietly, methodically taking everything. Her name was Huguette Marcelle Clark, and she was one of the wealthiest women in America. To understand how a woman worth over $1 billion in today's money could die with her estate in ruins, you have to start not with the lawyers or the accountant or the nurse. You have to start with copper. William Andrews Clark was one of the most powerful men of the Gilded Age. A Montana senator, a mining magnate, a man who built an empire from the ground up in the years after the Civil War, when copper was not merely a metal, but the circulatory system of a modernizing nation. Copper wired the telegraph lines. Copper ran through the electrical grids. Copper, in the late 19th century, was the lifeblood of American expansion, and Clark controlled vast rivers of it. By the time he died in 1925, he had accumulated what historians estimate to be the equivalent of several $100 million, a fortune so enormous that its weight would follow his descendants for generations. Huguette was born in 1906, the second daughter of William Clark's second family, conceived in his late 70s with a woman nearly 50 years his junior. She grew up in a world that most people cannot picture: a 21-room apartment on Fifth Avenue, another mansion on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., a 23-bedroom summer estate in Santa Barbara called Bellescardo, meaning beautiful view in Italian. She studied violin under the great Nadia Boulanger. She painted watercolors. She collected Japanese dolls, Hakata dolls, intricate and hand-painted, displayed in glass cases in a room most people never saw. She was shy, precise, and utterly removed from the grinding, ordinary world. In 1928, she married a dental surgeon named William Gower. The marriage lasted 8 months. She never remarried, and slowly, quietly, over the following decades, she withdrew. By the time the 1990s arrived, Huguette Clark was in her 80s, and her withdrawal was nearly complete. She had moved out of her apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue, but continued to pay rent on it, and on 2 adjoining units she also owned for decades without living there. The Bellescardo estate in Santa Barbara, a property sitting on 23 acres of coastal California land worth hundreds of millions, sat staffed and maintained, but unvisited. The Washington mansions similarly frozen. Rent, maintenance, property taxes, staff salaries, all of it paid, none of it used. And then, in 1991, she checked into Beit Israel Medical Center. She was not gravely ill. Doctors treated her for skin cancer and she recovered, but she stayed. She liked it there. She liked the quiet routine, the predictable rhythms, the nurses who came and went on schedule. In a world that had grown too loud and too fast, the hospital felt safe. She had her room decorated with her dolls. She had a telephone. She painted. And for the next 20 years, she lived on the 14th floor of that hospital while her properties gathered dust and her fortune gathered trustees. Here is where the numbers start to become staggering. Huguette Clark's estate at its peak, her properties, her art, her accounts, is estimated to have been worth somewhere between $300 million and $500 million at the time of her later years, translating to well over $1 billion in today's purchasing power. She owned a Stradivarius violin. She owned paintings by Renoir and Monet. She had in her Fifth Avenue apartment an original watercolor by herself, small, quiet things, depicting Japanese figures and flowering branches, alongside works that would eventually sell at auction for millions. She needed almost nothing. Her hospital bills were substantial, in some years exceeding $1 million, but still a fraction of her income. She had more money than she could conceivably spend, and that is precisely when the spending began. The first name that enters this story is Hadassah Piri. Piri was a nurse at Beit Israel, assigned to Huguette's care in the early 1990s. By most accounts, she was attentive, warm, and devoted. Huguette, starved of human connection, responded with extraordinary generosity. Over the years, and this is documented, not alleged, Huguette gave Hadassah Peary and members of her family more than $31 million. Gifts, not loans, not salary, gifts. Cash, properties, jewelry, a condominium in Florida. She paid for Peary's children's educations. She bought her a home. She once wired $5 million to Peary in a single transaction. The second name is Wallace Bock. He was Huguette's attorney, handling her affairs for years, and he received gifts and fees that investigators would later scrutinize. The third name is Irving Kamsler, her accountant. Both men were later implicated in a story that was less about dramatic theft and more about the slow, patient accumulation of access over a person who had no one else. And that is the crucial thing to understand about Huguette Clark. She had family, dozens of relatives, distant cousins and half-nieces and their children, people who bore the Clark name and occasionally wrote letters or sent Christmas cards. But she did not know them. She had outlived her immediate family decades ago. Her mother died in 1963. Her half-siblings were gone. The relatives who remained were, to her, strangers who happened to share a bloodline. So she gave to the people she saw every day. Over the course of her hospital years, Huguette spent money in ways that baffled outside observers but made a strange internal sense. She commissioned custom-made dollhouses, not toys, but elaborate miniature architectural structures costing tens of thousands of dollars each. She donated millions to a French foundation supporting arts and culture. She paid for the restoration of a château in Normandy that had once belonged to her mother's family, a property she would never visit, spending somewhere in the range of $10 million on its renovation. She bought a nurse's daughter a car. She bought another nurse's son a college education. None of this was irrational in isolation. All of it, taken together, reveals something heartbreaking. A woman who had reduced her entire social world to the 14th floor of a New York hospital and who expressed love in the only language she had left, which was money. In 2005, Huguette changed her will. This is the decision at the center of everything. Prior to that point, her estate was set to be divided among her relatives and several charitable causes. After 2005, after years of isolation, after years of contact almost exclusively with Peary, Bock, and Kamsler, she signed new documents that left the bulk of her estate not to family, but to a new foundation dedicated to art, and made substantial provisions for Peary. The relatives received nothing. Later investigation would raise serious questions about whether Huguette had the independent counsel to make those decisions freely, whether the isolation that surrounded her was organic or cultivated, whether the people closest to her understood that keeping her away from family kept them in position to receive her gifts. These questions were never definitively answered in court, but they were answered, in a way, by the legal avalanche that followed. Huguette Clark died on May 24, 2011. She was 104 years old. Within days, two competing wills surfaced, one from 2005, one from 2004, and the battle began. Her distant relatives, who had been cut out entirely, filed challenges. The New York Attorney General's office launched its own investigation into the conduct of Bock and Kamsler, examining whether they had manipulated an elderly, isolated woman for personal gain. Hadassah Peary, who had received over $31 million in documented gifts, was named in the proceedings. The estate, once a monument to Gilded Age copper money, became a courtroom. The trial preparation alone cost the estate millions. Legal fees mounted. The Beliscado estate, that 23-acre crown jewel on the California coast, was sold in 2018 for $68 million, a significant sum, but a fraction of what it might have commanded had it been maintained and developed. The Fifth Avenue apartment, unused for decades, sold for $27 million. The New York Attorney General's investigation ended with Bock and Kamsler agreeing to pay back approximately $13 million to the estate and surrendering their licenses. Peary agreed to return roughly $5 million in gifts and was otherwise allowed to keep the rest. And when the settlement dust cleared, when the legal bills were paid and the challenges resolved, the family received roughly $34 million to be divided among dozens of relatives. The charitable foundation Huguette had intended received a portion of the estate. Peary, despite returning some funds, had still received tens of millions over the course of 2 decades. The lawyers and accountant had paid penalties, but had also been paid substantially for years of management. The estate that had once been worth, by conservative estimates, $300 to $500 million had been reduced through legal costs, mismanagement, gifts, and decades of maintenance on unused properties to something significantly smaller. No single act of fraud, no single wire transfer, no dramatic moment of theft explains it. It was the compound interest of loneliness. This is the part of the story that resists easy villains. Hadassah Peary may have genuinely loved Huguette Clark. People who knew both women said there was real warmth between them, that Peary visited even on her days off, that Huguette lit up when she arrived. Whether that affection and the extraordinary financial gifts it generated constitute exploitation is a question the courts left partially unanswered. Peary was never criminally charged. The gifts were documented as voluntary. Bock and Kamsler operated in a grey zone that regulators found troubling enough to strip of their licenses, but not criminal enough, ultimately, to prosecute beyond civil penalties. They served as her primary connection to the outside world. They managed the checkbook of a woman who had no other trusted advisors. The system of oversight that should have protected a 104-year-old recluse, the banks, the legal bar, the medical institution itself, functioned, technically, but left enough space between its parts for millions of dollars to flow through unexamined. And Huguette herself, brilliant, eccentric, completely in command of her faculties by most accounts until very late in her life, made choices that puzzled the people who tried to reconstruct them afterward. She refused to see the relatives who came to Beit Israel asking for a visit. She hung up on callers she didn't want to speak with. She was not incapacitated. She was isolated, and isolation, over decades, reshapes the calculus of trust. Her watercolors sold at auction after her death. Delicate, careful images of Japanese landscapes and figures painted by a woman who had studied with great teachers and never stopped working. One sold for $19,000, another for $26,000. Small sums in the context of her estate, but in another sense, the most honest accounting of who she was, not a copper heiress, not a legal dispute, not a cautionary tale about elder financial abuse, but a painter sitting in a hospital room, making images of beautiful, unreachable places. The 3 mansions are all gone now, sold to developers and private buyers. The Fifth Avenue apartment was renovated and resold. Beliscardo's future remained in discussion for years, with various preservation efforts stalling against the property's astronomical value. The dolls were auctioned. The Stradivarius was auctioned. The Renoir was auctioned. Piece by piece, the material world of Huguette Clark was dispersed into the market, and what was left was the story. What the story tells us is not simply about greed, though greed may have played its part. It is about what happens when a human being retreats so completely from the world that the world ceases to function as a check on the people around her. Huguette Clark had every resource except the one that might have saved her estate. She had no one who loved her and had nothing to gain from it. The relatives who might have played that role were strangers to her. The professionals she employed were also her beneficiaries. The institution that housed her had no mechanism to ask why a wealthy recluse was writing 8-figure checks to her nurse. The law, designed to protect people like Huguette, arrived 20 years too late. She died in a hospital room surrounded by dolls and paintings in a building she had chosen because it felt safe. By every indication, she was content. She was also, in the precise financial sense, being quietly undone. There is something in that contradiction that refuses to resolve itself neatly. A woman of extraordinary privilege, made vulnerable by the very wealth that was supposed to protect her. A fortune built by one of the most ruthless men of the Gilded Age, eroded not by a market crash or a bad investment, but by 20 years of silence in a hospital room. The copper empire that built her world outlasted her by a century. Her world, in the end, lasted only as long as the people in it were watching.